program is brought to you by Agnes Scott College. For more information about Agnes Scott College, please visit our website at agnesscott.edu.
She teaches postmodern literature, poetry, and English 110. But her personal research is fiction writers that reconcile living in different cultures by creating fictional worlds that reconcile these cultural differences. Her articles include articles on Vladimir Nabokov, Salman Rushdie, Isaac Gerson, and Michael Sheldon. She also writes poetry, makes pottery, and dabbles in photography. Those are actually her words. I just thought it was very cute the way she wrote it. And also, her next project is going to be a book on the relationship between self-realization and modern poetry. Currently, she's about 1 week away from finishing a book. So everybody get real excited about that, because she's actually been 1 week away from publishing this book for about a year now. So fortunately, this won't be her last lecture. Now, I just want to prepare you. Since she's been writing and studying postmodern literature, she's lost her ability to be honest a little bit, so you may not be able to take this at face value. So I'd like you all to give a very warm welcome to Dr. Trousdale.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chris. And thank you very much for having me. I'm decidedly honored, and also, is this okay? Am I audible? Doppler shift going on here? All right. Yell or something if I'm not audible. I'm honored and also kind of surprised to be here. I really hope you guys don't know something about my health that I don't. Before I start, I'd like to thank the sophomores for inviting me. I'd like to thank my completely invisible to me with these lights audience for showing up. I want to give some very sincere and deep thanks to Drew Homa for his help in preparing the PowerPoint, to Tammy Stanko for her help in setting up, and to my friend Vladimir Vladimirovich for his help in some of the translations. And when you say what translations, you'll see. When Rachel asked me to give this lecture, she told me that I could speak on any subject that I wanted to. I know from the context that this lecture series really should be giving you something inspirational, hints on how to live the good life, advice for finding happiness, a meaningful existence. This kind of puts me in a difficult position. The kinds of lectures I've given before don't really seem like the inspirational dying words that I'd like to leave you with. Is Wallace Stevens a nature poet? It's interesting, and I'd even say it's important, but I kind of want to go out on something a little bigger than that, or at least something that matters a little more obviously. And anyway, this has an easy answer. Yup. And then because easy answers are generally sort of wrong, it's actually, except when he isn't. And anyway, that kind of yes, but lecture format, which I think we've all heard, doesn't really seem right for the occasion. Death, even hypothetical death, calls for a more absolute decision. It needs a climax. And more importantly, while Wallace Stevens' nature poetry is actually very much about the kinds of things I want to talk to you about, order, beauty, reason, it's his way of being about them and not mine. And so that makes him pretty much out of the question for anyone's last words but his own. But the biggest truths are pretty quickly stated. That's the Mandelbrot set, for those of you who aren't math majors. The biggest truths are pretty quickly stated. I can give you all of my real advice in 2 minutes, and if when I've said the next sentence you feel like you understand it all, feel free to get up and go home. Intensity, kindness, precision, consciousness, playfulness, skepticism, hope. That's what we've got to work with, that and our bodies. And if we don't listen to both our passionate loves and to our passionate aversions, we're not real people. So far, so good. I know some of you have the flu and stuff, so now you've got my point. You can go home. But it's in following through with that list that things get difficult. In my own life so far, I really haven't discovered how to teach my own passions to coexist. I can tell you that I love a number of things. Words, the things that words are made into, including both love poems and well-made arguments. Birds, bright colors in sunlight, the sensation of clay moving against my hands on a potter's wheel. Well-cooked food, especially if I was the one who cooked it. And a number of people whom I am not going to mention here because most of you don't know most of them, and anyway, they wouldn't like it. I love all of these things, and they make my life meaningful. And I'm not going to pretend I've had enough of them, or that I believe that there is such a thing as enough. If this were really my last lecture and I knew it, I would be appalled, not just to be dying, but to be dying before I found a way to make times and places overlap, to reconcile my private loves and my public duties and my professional work. My last words would be more like, "You've got to be joking," than anything in this lecture. Mortality seems to me like a terrible idea, and to borrow a line from Kierkegaard, I want a word with the manager. I can't advise you because I don't have a better key to living than anyone else, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. So, for this lecture, I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to follow the advice of two poets. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant, says Emily Dickinson. And Marianne Moore calls for poets to give us imaginary gardens with real toads in them. Those are actually frogs, but they were the closest I had. I'm a poet and a critic, not a philosopher or a scientist. And so while truth and reality are very much my concern, I find that I can't address them directly. Truth, to my ear, is very different from fact. By fact, I mean solid, unarguable statements. Look, I drop a pencil, it falls. My sensations are dependent on the firing of neurons in my brain. Man is mortal. None of these things are negotiable. None of them are amenable to alteration by anything in my power. And thus, none of them interest me as much as the question of how those facts add up to a larger picture, in which the dropping pencil and the dropping eyelid, which act following the same inevitable natural laws, are nonetheless as different in the sensations they evoke as a cat is from a catamaran. Oh, you didn't laugh. Truth is distinguished from mere fact by narrative, by context, by deliberate placement, and by the act of interpretation it demands of us. We use narratives to frame our lives. Sometimes they're inaccurate, but they convey a different kind of information than direct statements. If I tell you the story of my life, I'm not just going to get the dates wrong, I'm going to get facts wrong. I'll relay conversations in which I was amazingly witty, arguments in which I crushed the opposition, and these accounts will be false. And the truth that you can gain from my story is not the facts of my life. Instead, the truth of our stories is the truth of emotion, the truth of what it feels like to be another person, the truth of what really matters to us and why. If I have any truths to tell you myself, I'm sorry, but I can't tell them to you directly. So I'm turning to poetry and to narrative tonight. Fiction is a place we go for truths which are framed in false fact. Poetry is a place we go for truths in which facts are, to a certain degree, irrelevant. That's a slight overstatement, but I need it. My job as a critic, or part of it, is to find truths despite the pressures of fact, through the conjunctions, the patterns, the accruals of words and pictures in the lies of literature. Tonight, I'd like to pass that job on to you, because I think it's one of the best ways we have of figuring out what our lives mean. When I was preparing this lecture, I thought it was likely that anyone who would bother to come hear it would probably have either taken one of my classes or at least deliberately chosen not to take one of my classes. So rather than talking about any of the books I actually teach, Borges, Nabokov, Woolf, modern poets, I'm going to do something I can't possibly do in a formal classroom, which is to talk about the poetry of a Russian poet named Marina Tsvetaeva. It's possible that in the process you may learn something about how to live a good life, what truth is, what love is, and so on. But if you do, the credit goes entirely to her and to her story. Tsvetaeva is very little known. I doubt that any of you have encountered her work or possibly even heard of her. Certainly, she's not an influential figure in 20th century poetry, both because of her strange and rather reclusive life in exile and because of her particularly self-effacing attitude towards publication and translation. Nonetheless, I think her work merit consideration in a way perhaps related to how Pierre Menard's work does. The story that surrounds her writing helps to make her poems all the more extraordinary, and thus, I hope, illuminating. She tends to write very autobiographical poetry, a genre, I must confess, of which I am not very fond. While autobiography need not be synonymous with self-absorption, many autobiographical poets fail to move beyond their own concerns. They may have deep insight into their own inner workings, but they don't know how to generalize. They tell us truths, but only the truths of their own lives, not the truths of ours. Reading these poems can be like having coffee with an old friend, one you haven't seen in a long time, who, despite your friendship, seems to be interested only in herself. You sit for an hour and hear that she twisted her ankle, and that her coworker talks incessantly, and that her husband refuses to something. Perhaps it's move to a larger house, or have a second child, or maybe he's just really slow to wash the dishes. And at the end of the hour, you have no sense left of the world beyond the edges of her life, and everything seems to be bounded by the limits of her daily movements. And meanwhile, the extra cup of coffee that you drank is the pretext to sit there with her is at work. Your fingers twitch. You feel uneasy. Your feeling of dissatisfaction links itself to the vanishing of the light in the sky. The list of things you need to accomplish that evening, all of them boring, begins playing in your head. Take out the garbage, stop at the cleaners. Life becomes limited and sad, and all the sadder because it's gotten there through someone you used to love, and whom now you start to suspect you have no use for. Bad autobiographical poetry can do this. It leaves you with a sense that this is all that poetry can do. Replace one set of boundaries with another. Give you a window into someone else's windowless room. Change your own self-involvement for theirs. Which is, of course, not what poetry is for at all. If it's for anything, it's to change the nature of those walls, changing what they hold in and out, and what they hold up. But Zolotova's work is interesting, partly, of course, because while she writes about herself, she's not interested only in herself, but partly also because when we set her poetry against the backdrop of where she lived, we can see a great deal more than she tells us. Zolotova was born in 1898 to an aristocratic Russian family, the fourth of 5 siblings. Oops, my slide. There. The date of her birth is slightly complicated by the switch in 1918 from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar, but later in her life she celebrated her birthday, generally with some festivity, on April 1st. Like most children of her class, she grew up speaking both French and Russian. Her family is well educated, even by aristocratic standards, and in addition to a strong family tradition of both writing and music, included a number of scientists. Her uncle Yakov, for example, who's here in this picture in the family picnic in 1899, the year after she's born, he's the seated one in the dark coat, is sort of the center, what side is that? Right of the picture. Her uncle Yakov was a mathematician who in the 1890s published work in various French journals on mathematical patterning in natural forms. He corresponded with the Swedish mathematician Helge von Koch, who published one of the earliest papers on the mathematical patterns we now call fractals. That's the Koch snowflake playing there on the screen. Zolotova herself began writing poetry in both French and Russian when she was quite young, probably about 11 or 12. Since her early writings are long lost, we have only her word for their contents, but her account is fairly believable. In her late memoir, Sands, she describes the work of her teens as conventional experiments in Russian prosody and French frivolity. After the revolution, she fled first to Berlin, where there was a large emigre community, and where, among others, she met the poet Sirin and his wife-to-be Vera Slonim. Thence to Switzerland, where she lived for several years, and then on a slow journey through Europe, spending several of the years between the world wars in the south of France, a brief stint in Paris, several abodes in the Pays-Bas, an ill-conceived interval in Cordoba immediately before the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, and then finally, in 1936, she crossed the Mediterranean to Morocco, where she spent most of the rest of her life, remaining there through World War II, the Allied invasion, and the struggle for independence until her death in 1975. During all of this time, she was writing poetry in Russian, publishing when she could in émigré magazines, and later in Morocco, paying to print her own books at a bookbinder's in Tangiers. First editions of her work are so rare that I have been unable to find a photograph to show you, although this photograph was supposedly actually taken by her. It's of a Parisian literary group which published a few of her poems and includes Sylvia Beach, who's standing in the way back of the picture on the left-hand side. Instead of a picture, then, here's her own description of the first run of her 1963 book, Indifference, taken from her journal, which fortunately for me she kept in French. I, just in from the printers, deep green leather binding, golden lettering large on the cover, thick paper, hard to crumple. Unfortunately, the ink on the pages is a little too thick, and in some of the run has some smears, particularly for some reason in Shutka, which is a poem whose title translates from the Russian as joke, a short and unimportant poem located about a third of the way through the book. Zolotova's poetry is personal, but not personal in the sense of self-absorbed. Instead, she treats the personal as the starting point from which she can work to the interpersonal, not by generalization exactly, but by the presumption that the basis of meaningful communication is some form of shared experience. Among the experiences which she asks and expects her readers to share is death, not the final moment of death. When we witness death, we can be struck by it and find meaning or perhaps echoing lack of meaning within it, but death isn't an experience after which communication seems to be possible, and thus it's not something we can turn to as a shared experience. Instead, Zolotova is interested in the more approachable and discussable subject of near death, the expectation that death is imminent, which almost everyone over the age of, and I'm going to put a high number on this, say 20, has probably experienced, as the car in the rearview mirror grows suddenly enormous or the airplane falls abruptly into a pocket in the air. That moment of terror, of expectation, of disbelief is where Zolotova finds commonality, even among the almost impossibly varied peoples and languages she moves through. And while she doesn't fetishize death, she finds in it a certain value, namely that it provides a shared premise from which to work, a way of using the particularity of personal experience to understand something about the universal human condition. In her poetry, the certainty of death becomes the basis for other certainties too. The one shared experience provides the grounds for discussing the other primal experiences of love and hunger and the perception of beauty. Of course, some near-death experiences make better stories than others. As her biography suggests, Zolotova lived a life of some danger. 3 occasions in particular reappear in her poems as markers for the need to continually re-examine her own existence. They're interesting in part because they show why generalizing from a single experience can be so misleading. The 3 moments of mortal peril Zolotova keeps returning to, taken individually, might lead her to frame death in very different ways. Zolotova's poems tell us a story, then, not about death, but about her evolving understanding of death, which I guess is part of what we're here for, which draws on the experience not just of dying, but of framing a story about the near-death experience in comprehensible terms. What we learn from Zolotova's near-death experiences is not anything about death itself, which remains unknowable, but something about how to find a meaningful narrative in an apparently random experience. Zolotova, she wants to tell a story in which she's the main character without making the narcissistic error of believing herself to be the heroine. Takes her a while to come to this, of course. And for the first 20 years or so of her career, she's still very much present in the poems as an individual and almost as a heroic speaker. In her early poem, The Offer, Предложение in Russian, she addresses death directly, speaking as she would to a man who's been pursuing her. 3 times you have held me in your arms. 3 times you have asked me to ride on your winged horse and look down on the roofs of the village from among the stars. The next time you come, I will not be distracted by the scurry of the mice by the door. Death in The Offer becomes a suitor, one to be eventually accepted, and one who, on acceptance, will take the speaker into a new realm of beauty, distant but still visible from the earth, and from which the view of the earth itself becomes analogous to the view of the night sky. Once the speaker is embraced by death, the village, with its distracting mice eclipsed by the distance, will replace the sky as the distant and ethereal ideal. Meanwhile, however, the experience of life is so immersive as to actually prevent the speaker from dying. Her attention to trivial detail appears, for the moment, to preserve her. This is an odd poem, and maybe not a very good one, in part because she's looking back at Russia in it, not through her own eyes, but through the eyes, as I bet some of you can see, of Chagall. Not her own aristocratic experience before the revolution, but an appropriated version of Chagall's peasant Russia, a Jewish peasant Russia at that, far removed from her aristocratic one and mythologized into an Russia, an absolute Russia, and then bolstered with a claim of realism via those mice. It's an odd poem because we can't possibly believe her. This can't be the Russia she remembers, and it can't be what death will be taking her away from. So why does she do it? Why, if for any reason besides a misplaced desire to write like a Russian from the point of view of a non-Russian? One answer to this question comes in the form of one of her near-death experiences, one of the most picturesque of the lot, and one of the earliest, which occurred when she was escaping from the revolution. In 1919, her oldest brother, who's here shown seated next to her, she's the one holding the dog and he's behind her. Her oldest brother came abruptly to the attention of the authorities when he started agitating to prevent some wrongful arrests, or what he felt to be wrongful arrests by the revolution. The entire family, after the harassment began, decided to leave the country as quickly as possible. Arrangements were made, but immediately before they could depart, her grandmother, that's her grandmother, then in her mid-70s, became severely ill. Tsvetaeva, aged 20, was the member of her family who seemed least endangered by staying to nurse the old lady. Her father was a well-known public figure under the old regime, and thus persona non grata in the new one. Her mother was a rather autocratic person, ill-suited to keeping a low profile. And her eldest brother, of course, was the reason for the family's flight. As the rest of the family boarded a train which was to take them over a series of changes, first to Tallinn in Estonia, and then on to Riga in Latvia, and finally to Berlin, Tsvetaeva and her grandmother took up an improbable residence in the village house of a relative of her maid's. This isn't the actual house, it's just to give you an idea of what it would have looked like. The house was a long way from the romanticized village huts implied in the offer, but it's also a long way from the mansion in which Tsvetaeva grew up. The mattresses in this new place were stuffed with straw, and the ticking evidently made her sneeze. This is another set of randomly assorted Russian huts, but with some members of the Red Army in front as atmospheric additions. Courtesy of the Life Photo Archive. Thank you, photographers. In her journal, Tsvetaeva writes about hiding with the family of her maid. She was worried that even if no one informed on her, her hands would give her away as a member of the aristocracy because they lacked calluses. And when not waiting on her grandmother, she spent much of her time trying to do household chores to toughen them up. Doubtless, she was not very good at the tasks she took on. She talks in the journals about how horrible the clothes washing water got as it cooled, filmed with soap, slightly tinged blue with dye leaked out of the clothing. In a funny borrowing from the Russian practice of verbing color nouns, she describes the water as emblué, that's emblued. And while the water was still warm enough to get clothing clean, it could be cold enough to evaporate chillingly off the skin on the inner arm, where her rolled up sleeve left her arm wet and exposed in the air. She came near to exposure herself only once during this time, when 4 soldiers from the Red Army came through the village. Somewhat remarkably, her presence had not caused much comment among the neighbors. She and her grandmother had been introduced as cousins, displaced by the recent upheavals of the war, and while her speech must have seemed unfamiliar, the family she was staying with was an educated one, and the contrast between herself and her maid was not as great as might have been expected. When the soldiers stopped at the house, her greatest risk was her own panic, which might easily have caused her to do or say something to draw attention to herself, perhaps by driving from her head the newly learned motions of household work and causing her to make some egregious mistake, adding soap to the potatoes, or putting starch in cold clothes rinsing water. Fortunately, when the soldiers arrived, she was at the back of the house's one large room feeding soup to her grandmother. And while she recalls that her hand shook and spilled drops down the old woman's front, she was able to remain more or less unremarked. This situation lasted 3 weeks, at the end of which her grandmother, who had appeared to be recovering, abruptly died. This, though sad, simplified matters, and Tsvetaeva followed her family into exile. But the time she spent with her maid's family, short though it was, appears to have influenced the style of her poetry. As we saw in the example of The Offer, she sometimes adopts the semi-mystical style of the Russian fairy tale, a big break from the highly formal Pushkinian Russian poems she claims to have written in her earlier life. The contrast between the peasant lyricism of the poems and the aristocratic French of the journals is peculiar, and in fact, while they aren't the full set of disjointed selves she tries to reconcile throughout her life, they make a nice case study in the origins of her lifelong interest in the multiplicity of individual experience and the ways in which our many internal selves can help us understand the many people around us. Tsvetaeva's second near-death experience occurred shortly after she fled to Germany and was reunited with her family. Since her Aunt Luba, this is the same picnic picture we saw before, Aunt Luba's the one there next to Uncle Yakov here. Aunt Luba, Uncle Yakov, much easier than trying to describe. Her Aunt Luba had already fled to Switzerland, and the Tsvetaeva family went to join her in Geneva. Tsvetaeva and her 2 brothers were avid hikers and took a number of trips into the surrounding mountains. During one of these, in April of 1920, when they were quite high up on a bare pass, a lightning storm abruptly blew up. Now, to describe this as a near-death experience is a bit of an exaggeration, or maybe, since the storm appears to have been several miles away, and all the party experienced was a slight drizzle of rain. But the storm was evidently quite dramatic, with regular lightning strikes at their elevation only a few miles away. And Tsvetaeva seems to have been convinced that they were in severe danger, as indeed they might have been if the winds had shifted a bit. In her longer poem, The Storm, she writes this about the event. "At first I thought the horror was to die far from you, but then I discovered that the horror was to die." The experience of the storm seems to have focused her mind on death not as a relational event, a catastrophe brought on by human interaction, as when she feared arrest by the soldiers, or as an event made catastrophic by a lack of human interaction, as when the horror of death comes from dying far from you, whoever you is, but actually to treat death as an absolute. Death by lightning strike is independent of human agency or interpretation. This lack of human context renders her reaction to death individual almost to the point of solipsism. In her journals, she's struck by the selfishness of her fear. She writes that she looked at their guide, who was carrying a tall walking stick, and thought, surely the lightning will strike him and not me. After the fact, she's ashamed of this, as anyone would be, but interestingly seems not to renounce it. And remember, she's only about 20 at the time, so it's perhaps not terribly selfish not to want to die in a random hiking accident. In her journal, she also remarks on the difference between her own experience and Wordsworth's in The Prelude, which she had read the year before. Whereas Wordsworth hikes the Alps in a fog and doesn't know at the moment that he crosses the Simplon Pass, Tsvetaeva is struck by the clarity with which she saw the full thunderstorm. "I could see," she writes, "the ranks of clouds progressing for miles beyond me, and each stroke of lightning as clear as the whiskers on a cat. The whole storm, in fact, moved like some great kind of hunting beast, the gray fur of the clouds over terrible, invisible limbs." The third near-death experience comes later, in 1937, at the beginning of her time in Morocco. Early after her arrival in Casablanca, she contracted typhoid fever. This is quite a different kind of mortal peril than the first 2. During the Russian Revolution, she's in danger from people, so that the threat of violence appears to be still very much part of the realm of human actions. Her success or failure in her escape would be due to the operations of the human mind, one way or another. In the storm, she's in danger from a natural force, something which can't be reasoned with, but something which is still avoidable by rational action. All she had to do was scurry down the side of the mountain to get out of range of the storm. In the case of illness, the enemy is within. Not only the germs contained in the body, but also in her body's reactions to the germs. The high fever, which is characteristic of typhoid, is the body's attempt to burn out the infection. This is a very different type of lightning strike. Her experience of the hallucinations of fever becomes bound up with her understanding of the disease itself, even after she's once again well enough to return to writing in her diaries. She writes, "This is an illness which contaminates what you touch, and I was told that my nightclothes and sheets must be burned after I was well again, or dead, as they did not say, but as I heard. For the rest of the fever, each time I stretched out my hand to take something, I felt the heat of the fever creeping into it, drying it out and readying it for the fire, and I too, in my body, growing drier and lighter, burning and preparing to be burned." Her understanding of death evolves in a pattern to which these three experiences provide something of a map. First, as quite a young writer, she sees death, as we saw, as a hostile force akin to the Red Army seeking her, and thus as an enemy which could be evaded or fooled. Then, shortly thereafter, during the incident in the Alps, she revises her attitude towards death, no longer describing it in the terms of human malice, but instead simply as self-interested, like that hunting beast that she sees in the clouds. After the attack of typhoid, however, her descriptions of death undergo a much larger change, and rather than treating death as an external force, and that both the storm and the soldiers are outside of her, she treats death as a part of the body that's already there, like an organ or an invisible limb. Witness these lines from the early 1940s. "You leave the house, and I feel your absence inside me, in my heart, in my knees, in my death." For the rest of her career, death in her poetry provides a means of testing the limits, not so much of the individual's life, but of her ability to step outside of herself, to see patterns which extend beyond her immediate horizon. Death becomes both the means of limitation, the thing which we can't move beyond, and the test of the communion, the thing which we must transcend if we are to understand each other with real intimacy, real generosity of spirit. But if death provides the moment of intimacy which allows communication, it's not the thing that needs to be communicated. We're all going to die whether we learn about it or not. For Tsvetaeva, death may be the starting point of many of the poems, but it's not the poem's point, any more than the point of this lecture is Tsvetaeva herself. You may have noticed the you in these poems. They're all spoken to someone. Interestingly, though, the someone she spoke to most often in her work, the man who became her lover for 30 years, doesn't enter her life until she's in her 40s in Morocco. A French pilot, mapmaker, photographer, and general ne'er-do-well named Paul Améry. By the time she meets Améry in Kenya in 1938, she's written a whole selection of what in retrospect turn out to be love poems to him, like this poem called The Dolphins, written on shipboard shortly before their first meeting. "Around us, rush, risk, ruin, crash, but we are smiling, wet, awash, awake, backs down, beneath white foam, bow wave, iron boat, a lean-muscled laugh. They see pieces, a belly, a snout, but the leap is surprise. They see the arc, the blowhole, the fin. They think that they only see one of us." In the period from 1938 until about 1943, as their relationship deepens, the poems become more direct. But starting in 1944, there's something of a return to the general you of the earlier poems, which, as in the poem about the lightning storm, seems to be readable equally as the individual beloved person and as a more general kind of love, either her lost Russia or the fact of love itself. Her first meeting with Améry is documented in her journals as an incidental event. They encountered each other through a mutual friend, the Swedish Baroness von Silber, who arranged a months-long, lavish, and rather daunting-sounding expedition, a compound sightseeing and hunting trip, which included a yacht journey along the northern coast of Africa to Egypt, where the party stopped to see the pyramids, and then through the Suez Canal, down along the Red Sea, around the Horn of Somalia, and finally to what is now Kenya, then British East Africa, for a protracted safari, conducted largely via airplane, and ending in a visit to Khalifa Ibn Karub, the Sultan of Zanzibar, who kept a remarkable private menagerie. Améry met up with the expedition in British East Africa, where he acted as one of the pilots. He must have cut a dashing figure, a tanned, fit, physically adventurous man who spoke English and German in addition to his native French, and who had both technical expertise as a pilot and wide-ranging reading habits. Books on his shelves at the end of his life, when they were inventoried, included the travels of Richard Burton, the works of Racine, and books of prints on Italian Renaissance painters, as well as, of course, a significant library on navigation. But he doesn't seem to have made much of an impression on Tsvetaeva at the time of their first meeting. Her journals concentrate instead on the real purpose of the trip, the weeks of hunting in the bush. She didn't participate much in the shooting, but she became very involved in the stalking and observing of the wildlife. In her journal, she writes in particular about a herd of elephants that they encountered. The trunks swung in counterpoint with their swinging legs, and while one was boneless and the other jointed only at the knee and ankle, each seemed the same pendulum. They stirred loose a cloud of dust, which, rather than turning daylight to sunset, eclipsed the notion of time, so that their passage seemed both instant and enduring. As they moved past and away from us, I felt that time itself, like those swinging gray limbs, was looped, enclosing, propelling, and protecting some great gray body in the center. And what is that great gray body in the center? What is that thing that time in the form of our memories loops around, moves, keeps in place in the dust? Legs like columns, yellow and brown spirals ascending them. Hold the heavy, grained balloon. Hold it down, hold it aloft, and past the skin, past the folds at the shoulders, the moving ears. What intelligence is there in that heavy skull, and how can intelligence move with its own bones protruding in front of it? Just in case that was making you seasick. The centrality of the elephants' bodies in this image of eternity places her in the periphery, part of time, part of materiality, and not necessarily part of the eternal truth that she sees in front of her. For Tsvetaeva, the passing herd of elephants, like near-death experiences, teaches us our own non-centrality. While we're capable of understanding what matters in the world, we ourselves are not what matters. The autobiography in Tsvetaeva's poems follows this principle to its logical extreme. While she is of necessity bounded by her own perceptions, her poems constantly look for ways to move their centers not only away from her own limitations, but away from even the centrality of humanity. The intelligence of those elephants troubles her for years, as we see in Shutka, Joke, the poem whose ink was smeared in that first edition. Never, and you laugh, but never do I feel I know the tip of the cat's tail, the thud of the elephant tusk against the tree, the shiver as along the bone the waves of sound enter the skull, the neck, the back, and propagate back down to the earth. And again, you laugh and shiver with your own sound, your own contusion. Tsvetaeva's relationship with Améry probably begins with the expedition's visit to the Sultan of Zanzibar. The friendship seems to have crystallized over a particular absurd encounter that took place there. The Baroness von Silber had arranged for the group to meet the Sultan and to tour the grounds of his palace, a magnificent, many-courtyarded building in the Arab style near Stone Town on Zanzibar. Adjacent to the palace was a wildlife park, occupying several square miles, a surprisingly large piece of a very small island. The Sultan, or perhaps his predecessors, had stocked the park with several species of exotic animals, birds imported from South America and Asia, an enclosure of Chinese deer, and most strikingly, a pair of tigers brought from India. The group was taken on a drive around the preserve to view the tigers, which they located cooling themselves in a stream at the bottom of a ravine. The group watched the tigers for perhaps 20 minutes, an experience which Tsvetaeva found exhilarating. She writes in her journals about Blake when she describes the event. And then the group returned to the palace. So far, so good. A brush with the power of nature, akin to, and as it happened, as safe as, her observation of the elephants. But before they left, they were ushered into the waiting room of the Sultan's palace so they could bid him a final adieu. And there on the wall was a large photograph of the tigers that they had just observed in the stream where they had observed them, taken through a telephoto lens. Printed on top of the photograph were the English words, "Do not fear, only believe." Only believe, Tsvetaeva writes in her diary that night. Only believe? The impossibility of it, as though beauty could be revoked or filtered into triviality, as though what burned there were not sinews, as though strength did not eat. The Baroness appeared to observe nothing and was as eager as ever for the next event on her tour. But I was terrified that I would be unable to say goodbye to our host without some error, without scolding him for his foolhardiness in trusting to belief as a preventative for attack by tigers, without laughing at such earnest falsehood, without saying that my belief is that the tiger may be hungry, without rushing to the picture to remedy the error in orthography. Miss Mallon, one of the other guests, seemed unmoved. Lenka, another Russian protege of the Baroness's, did not seem to notice, but unhappily, Améry saw the whole joke and kept shooting his eyes sideways at the photograph as we were in the room, and as we were leaving for the Sultan's divan, offered me his arm, I think, to give me some ballast against the terrible tides of laughter. A sympathetic arm, if dusty. During the last few weeks of the trip, a friendship sprang up out of their shared inability to believe in abstract tigers, as Améry stayed with the party for the yacht ride back to Casablanca. It was not, however, a shipboard romance. Quarters were tight, and Tsvetaeva seems not to have relished the lack of privacy on board. Her journal entries are testy and mention seasickness as often as they mention Améry. A week after the expedition's return to Casablanca, however, Tsvetaeva and Améry encountered each other in the street, a short distance from the house where she had rooms. Améry walked Tsvetaeva back to her door, chatting. That night, Tsvetaeva's tone about Améry is quite different. From her journals again. I set the key in the lock and turned it, pushed the door open a few inches, and turned myself to say goodbye. When I did, he was there, perhaps a meter off, and suddenly he was quite different. Or perhaps I mean, suddenly he ceased to be the different person he has seemed until now. I think really it was the angle of the sun, but he seemed to be coated with a thin layer, not of dust as he was in Tanganyika, but of gold. And I felt most oddly as though the only thing to do were to kiss him. It seemed suddenly that I knew him, and that he had for years been my lover, and a kiss would be natural and expected. Of course, I said goodbye, and I think he cannot have noticed any difference in my manner, but the feeling has not yet passed. Very strange. I can only hope that the next time I see him, the light will have returned to normal. Evidently, it didn't. This entry was in late May. By August, Améry, always somewhat nomadic, had moved his boxes of books and maps into her rooms. At about this time, her poetry becomes more concerned with bodily details. Her poems start to include descriptions about the crack of the jaw when you yawn, the satisfaction of fully stretching out an arm, and a rather terrifying poem centering around the peculiar feeling of imaginary insects brushing against the backs of her bare legs in the dark, only to find the next morning that the backs of her knees are covered with tiny conical bites. The correlation between the start of the affair and her increased interest in the body is not perfect, but it's fair to say there's an overlap between the growth of the romance and the growth of her interest. Tsvetaeva's interest in the body is not particularly sexual, nor is it, despite earlier emphases in her poetry, particularly focused on the body's mortality. Instead, her poetry focuses on the experience of inhabiting flesh, more even than on the consciousness or on the awareness of time, as the common experience which we can share not only with ourselves, but with animals like those elephants in Kenya. While in joke she emphasizes the foreignness of the tip of the cat's tail, the blending of flesh with consciousness, the proprioceptive sense which tells us the location of the limbs, becomes, for Tsvetaeva, the final means by which we experience beauty and thus enter into a transcendent state of communication with the rest of the world. She writes, "In the tips of my fingers, the splinter, the cactus, the ocean." What Tsvetaeva wants us to take from her work is comparatively simple. an understanding of the interconnections between the physical and phenomenological worlds. Tsvetaeva asks us to see how our shared physicality can teach us sympathy not only with other humans, but with the natural world at large, so that we see ourselves not only as individuals, but as part of a larger commonality. Her sense of the shared universal is based on the experience of physicality in time, a commonality which is inherently redemptive because it's the basis of love, but which also can be redemptive only when it's extended beyond the individual, because the individual is mortal. But I think there's another thing that we as readers can learn from her as well, which is the art of pattern recognition. Not the authorially constructed patterns of fiction, because of course those must be absent from our lives, but the patterns of nature, the possibility of finding the grounds for mutual recognition between ourselves and the tiger, ourselves and the elephant, not only because we all have bodies, but because we are all, in the end, the subjects of stories. Tsvetaeva's hilarified outrage over the caption on the photograph of the tiger is in itself an important lesson, because it's a conflict with the anonymous caption writer over the correct grounds for interpretation. According to Tsvetaeva, our interpretations cannot be limited to the abstract, the symbolic, or the pretty. Instead, a substantive understanding of the world must recognize the interdependence of beauty and danger. Tigers are carnivorous and will not let you pet them. The hard fact of a tiger's teeth, and not very much is harder than that, does not diminish Tsvetaeva's sense of the transcendence of watching real tigers in the stream, any more than it diminishes the beauty of Blake's poem. Instead, it's where the sense of transcendence actually comes from. At the same time, however, Tsvetaeva's love poems, predating her love affair by years that they do, are no less authentically about the nature of love. We approach our ideas from one end or the other, from the ghost or from the claw. What Tsvetaeva tells us, however, is that we only reach them when we've found both. I'd like to end with an apology. I may have gotten some of my facts wrong. Preparation for this lecture has involved work in 2 different languages, only one of which I read at all fluently, and neither of which is the one in which I'm addressing you tonight, and which is, as you may have noticed, my actual native language. I may have misinterpreted Tsvetaeva's meanings. Indeed, the version of her that I've given you this evening really may be my own invention entirely. But I'm not sure that matters. Poets are imaginary. My imagining of her work is what makes her a poet. I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture that there are a number of people I love. Tsvetaeva is one of them. John Keats is another, the poet who wrote Ode to a Nightingale. Now more than ever seems it sweet to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain, who as a small boy of 5 or 6 stood in front of the door of his dying mother's room, armed with a wooden sword to keep out visitors who might disturb her. To love someone who died 154 years before you were born, you have to imagine them. But then, to love anyone, you have to imagine them. Your understanding of your mother, your sister, your lover, all of these are acts of the imagination. You have not created the body of the person that you love. Even if you gave birth to it, it keeps on growing afterwards. But you create the picture of it that you carry in your mind. Love is not less real for being rooted in the imagination. It's only less predictable, less tractable, and sometimes less forgiving. We imagine what it's like to be other people. And you imagine yourself. And those of us who, like Tsvetaeva, know that we are our own constructions, can take control of the plans. We can choose to make patterns which link our various loves, our childhoods, our terrors, the different languages that we speak in different places, to see not only common threads, but the shared fabric. We find in ourselves the truths which bind us to others. We find in our stories a way to tell those truths comprehensibly, truths about love, about what's beautiful, about what matters outside of ourselves. Much of this lecture has been about Tsvetaeva's discussions of death. Why then are we ending on the subject of love? Because like death, love is something in which we're both alone and part of a universal human experience. But unlike death, in the moment that it happens, the moment when we discover that what we are feeling is love, in that moment we're as close as we can ever come to being another human being. that shared experience teaches us not only what it's like for people to fall in love, but also teaches us to imagine a selfhood, a subjectivity, a person who is clearly and definitively not ourselves. Of course, we may stop with our beloveds. People who love may remain narcissistic in their relations with the rest of the world, but they shouldn't and they need not, because love, like death and like poetry, teaches us how to feel the emotions of another human being. And once we know how to do that, we have no reason and no excuse to stop. We are our own imaginary gardens, and if we're good, we populate ourselves with real toads. Thank you.